They noticed humanity long before humanity knew anyone was watching. From a distant arm of the Orion Spur, an observation lattice belonging to the Cerati Concorde detected the first impossible signal, a primitive species, still bound by biology and carbon limitations, launching metal coffins of hope into a void they did not understand. At first, the Cerati archivists documented the event with bored routine, yet another emerging primate descendant, yet another short-lived curiosity likely to annihilate itself in a century or two. Evolution produced countless brief flickers of intelligence in the galaxy, but very few became civilizations. Most died strangled by tribal instinct, entropy of violence, or cultural decay. The Concorde expected Earth to follow that same dissolving pattern. But within just a few cycles, a strange deviation emerged. These creatures did not behave like other pre-contact sapiens. Other species looked upward out of fear, these looked upward out of longing. The first anomaly was willpower. Not instinctive survival. Not desperation. Humans chose to suffer for progress. They hurled themselves at hostile skies not because shelter failed, but because they refused to accept limitation. They froze in vacuum, burned on re-entry, drowned in salt oceans while testing hulls, and kept coming back. Species normally withdrew when nature proved teeth. Humanity leaned forward, staring straight into the abyss as if daring the universe to blink first. The Cerati sociometric models failed to predict this behavior with 99.8% deviation. Statistical impossibility. A biological creature should not mortgage its own life for a possibility beyond calculation, yet humans made a culture out of betting everything on tomorrow. The second anomaly was narrative. The Cerati discovered early recordings from human probes, plaques containing stories, music, coordinates, identity. No other world-bound species had ever imagined that someone might be listening. To send a greeting into the infinite when no proof existed of a listener bordered, by all rational metrics, on insanity. And yet, to humans, it was hope, refined into message. Hope institutionalized as artifact. A declaration into oblivion, we exist, and we wish to be known. The Cerati observers maintained distance and patience, convinced the species would collapse under its own internal contradictions. But centuries passed, and the collapse never came. Humanity bled, wept, fractured, tore itself apart 1,000 times, and then rebuilt from its own rubble, always angling upward. Other species grew disciplined, humans grew defiant. Other species found equilibrium, humans found momentum. Other species sought safety, humans sought frontier. It was as if the entire planet incubated a philosophy more dangerous than any weapon: the future belongs to those willing to imagine it before it exists. When humans finally developed interstellar propulsion in its infant form, crude, uneven, laughably energy inefficient, the Cerati expected hesitation. They predicted a slow crawl outward, limited tests, years of caution. Instead, humanity launched expeditions disguised as research missions. They risked extinction against vacuum simply to ask better questions. They left home not because they were ready, but because readiness, to their strange psychology, was irrelevant. A human does not jump because the landing is guaranteed, a human jumps because not jumping means dying while standing still. This was the first moment the Concorde trembled. Not with fear, with recognition. They saw in humanity what the galaxy had not seen in a million years, a species that does not wait for destiny, it writes it. Examination logs began shifting tone, no longer zoological, now strategic. No longer curious, now cautious. The Cerati Classification Codex, built over 20,000 years of cataloging newborn civilizations, held no suitable category for a sapience built from volatility and prophecy stitched together into culture. The more they observed, the louder a forbidden question grew across their council chambers. If these creatures survive long enough to mature, what will they become? Because in humans, the Cerati detected not mere intelligence, but aspiration as a biological constant. A species whose biology carried ambition the way lungs carry breath. They were not stable. They were accelerating. Not toward conquest, but toward self-invention. This was not another galactic participant forming, it was a variable powerful enough to rewrite the game board itself. And for the first time in a very long age of comfortable cosmic stasis, the Sereti realized the galaxy might soon no longer belong to those who preserved what is, but to those who dared to build what could be. What unsettled the Sereti most was not humanity's strength, but its fragility. Power they understood, there were elder species that could lift mountains with singular pulses of gravitic harmonics, there were post-scarcity dynasties that had mastered entropy stabilization for entire planets. But none of those had ever leapt before proof. Humans did not wait to become invincible before stepping into danger. They stepped while still breakable, while fear still had teeth, while uncertainty still swallowed every guarantee. Their courage did not spring from superiority, but from vulnerability weaponized into movement. The Sereti found archived footage from early Earth, grainy images of explorers trekking toward uncharted poles with frostbitten fingers, divers plunging beneath black waters where light had never lived, entire generations who built rockets from metal scraps not to escape death, but to touch wonder. It was not rational. It was not optimized. It was human. The deeper the Sereti peered into humanity's psychology, the more the data models shredded into irrelevance. They traced myth, folklore, literature, and discovered something disturbing woven into humanity's long past. They told stories about the future before they could build it. This is what broke the Council's philosophical immunity. Most civilizations emerged into awareness by describing what was, but humans used imagination as scaffolding for what could be, centuries before the tools existed. They dreamed forward. They rehearsed cosmic expansion inside their own minds long before it was physically feasible. It dawned on the archivist that humanity had not entered space in the 21st century. Humanity had entered space the first time a primitive ancestor looked up at a night sky and felt longing instead of fear. To the Sereti, this was monstrous. No species should carry the future in its blood before its science catches up. That is the seed of destiny, or collapse. Yet humanity danced on that razor's edge as if the fall itself were a staircase. Their weapon was not technology, not fleet strength, not genetic engineering. Their weapon was becoming. A perpetual self-creation. The Concord had seen world breakers and tyrant kings, empires carved from planetary bones, silent hive minds so unified they ceased to know loneliness, but they had never seen a species that forged identity not from origin, but from trajectory. The Sereti finally initiated covert contact, not with greetings, but with study. They infiltrated transmissions, shadowed signals, and tasted emotional resonance buried in human broadcasts. What they found defied every established doctrine of sapient evolution. Humans forged heroes not out of victory, but out of sacrifice. The mythic skeleton of their culture was not conquest, it was risk taken for a future yet unborn. Humanity glorified the one who walked into darkness so someone else could someday see light. A race that sanctifies forwardness is not bound by survival, it is bound by becoming more than what it began as. And such a species, if left unchecked, would not merely join the galactic order, it would rewrite it. The panic did not start with fear of invasion. It began with fear of contagion. If humans entered the interstellar stage, they would export imagination the way stars export fusion. Other civilizations, stagnant and comfortable, might awaken. The ancient political equilibrium, the cold, quiet stability of a galaxy that had long ago chosen predictability over transcendence, could fracture. The Concord had ruled for millennia not through tyranny, but through stagnation disguised as wisdom. Humanity threatened that stasis simply by existing. Even the Sereti youth began to speak of the humans with something dangerously close to reverence. They whispered that perhaps the Concord had grown old, safe, still, that perhaps the galaxy had waited too long for a traveler who would not ask permission from fear. The High Council tried to suppress such thinking, but curiosity is a wildfire once oxygen reaches it. The human question grew into prophecy. What will they do once they realize they are not alone? The archivist, in a sealed report never meant for public release, wrote the line that would later be quoted as the first omen of the Great Shift. We expected to witness another civilization's beginning. Instead, we may be witnessing the birth of a civilization that teaches the others how to begin again. For the first time in ages, the Concord activated its Guardian Protocol not against threat of war, but against threat of awakening. Because if humanity learned how extraordinary its own nature already was, if it realized its deepest power was not invention but transformation, then no older empire could tame the future. They could only become students of it. And so the Sereti made a decision older civilizations always make when facing something they do not understand. They tried to slow what they were too afraid to let grow. They chose secrecy, containment, observation without acknowledgement. But destiny is a stubborn river, it bends stone over centuries. Humanity was already reaching outward while still inventing what humanity means. And in that contradiction lived their terrifying genius. They were not ready. Yet they moved. They were not powerful. Yet they believed. They were not safe. Yet they advanced. And the Sereti realized, too late, that by the time the rest of the galaxy noticed, humanity would not be asking for a seat at the table. They would be building new tables. What came next was the moment the Sereti historians would one day call the fracture of assumptions. For millennia, the galaxy had believed there were only two paths for a new civilization: either it became a predator, harvesting worlds until challenged, or it became a philosopher, renouncing ambition to achieve sterile equilibrium. They believed evolution was a corridor with a binary exit. Humanity refused both doors. They did something no model predicted: they turned struggle into identity. They turned uncertainty into fuel. They did not endure suffering as a condition, they volunteered for it, as if the act of bearing burden was a ritual through which tomorrow was purchased. The Sereti found old human recordings of mountain climbers freezing on lonely summits not to conquer anyone, but to prove to themselves that limitation was negotiable. They studied footage of rescue workers running toward burning buildings while physics begged them to retreat. They watched humans endure separation, pain, cosmic loneliness, and then named these very scars proof of forward motion. This terrified them. Because such a psychology is not stable. It does not settle. It spreads. A species like this is a philosophical virus. The moment another civilization witnesses that courage is not a reaction but a philosophy, the entire moral axis of the galaxy shifts. Power is no longer inherited, it becomes earned. Future is no longer bequeathed, it becomes forged. The Sereti began to understand that humanity was not approaching the stars because it had solved its flaws, it was approaching because those flaws were the launch fuel. They bled, and called it wisdom. They failed, and called it rehearsal. They broke, and called it metamorphosis. The Sereti panicked too late, because by the time they recognized the shape of the threat, something irreversible had already awakened, human meaning scaled into civilization. This had never happened before. Philosophy was normally a luxury of individuals. But humans exported philosophy as culture, and then exported culture as trajectory. They didn't merely build machines, they built purpose delivery systems. The Sereti intercepted early human colony transmissions, expecting resource reports, mineral inventories, and tactical navigation data. What they found instead were poems. Captains naming stars not with coordinates, but with hope. Engineers carving the names of lost loved ones into bulkhead plating so memory would become architecture. Pioneers reading ancient myths while orbiting new suns, as if the human spirit treated each frontier not as conquest, but dialogue with destiny. A lesser species expands to own. Humanity expands to become. The High Council's anxiety shifted into dread when the first human deep-range expedition made the most irrational decision imaginable: they saved another species before they even knew that species existed. A rogue wave of solar debris threatened a helpless microcivilization still in its pre-electronic age, a world no interstellar polity had ever bothered to intervene for. Humans rerouted a generation ship, losing 6 years of trajectory and thousands of tons of resource margin, just to alter the debris course. They saved a people they would never meet, who would never know who preserved them. The act brought no advantage. No political leverage. No trophy. And yet, humanity called it obvious. This was the moment a Sarati overseer whispered, in a voice half horror and half reverence. They don't wait for worthiness to be declared. They create it. Other galactic powers act when they are strong. Humans act to become strong. Other powers wait until danger is justified. Humans justify themselves by facing danger. For the first time in its long, unchallenged memory, the Concord felt small. They had mastered existence. Humanity had mastered becoming. The Sarati now realized the terrible truth no longer hidden behind curiosity: humanity was not an evolutionary product, it was an evolutionary escalation. The next kind of thinking. The next template. A species that does not grow from the world that shaped it, but grows beyond the world that explained it. And if such a species ever realized its own trajectory, fully and consciously, it would transcend every ceiling by attacking the very idea of ceilings. The galaxy had been static. Old. Settled. A museum of civilizations that had stopped asking, why not? And humanity arrived not as disruptors, but as reminders that becoming is the only antidote to stagnation. The Concord's darkest fear was no longer invasion. It was inspiration. Because the galaxy could stop a fleet. It could not stop a story. The Sarati might still have contained humanity, isolated them, stalled their ascent, corralled their expansion through soft barriers of misinformation, had it not been for one catastrophic miscalculation: they believed humans sought planets. But humanity was never colonizing land. Humanity was colonizing possibility. They were not expanding outward for territory, they were expanding outward for becoming. A habitat was just a chrysalis, a frontier was just a cocoon, and the act of stepping beyond familiarity was metamorphosis given geography. When the Sarati finally grasped this, the council chambers fell silent with the dread that only arrives when one realizes they are not watching history, they are watching its replacement. A species that needs not victory to grow, only challenge. A species that needs not certainty to move, only direction. The tipping point came when human explorers encountered a spatial rift, a gravitational shear that consumed 3 survey vessels before anyone even understood its topology. Every other civilization that had encountered this anomaly over the cosmic ages had designated it a memorial boundary: here ends wisdom. Humanity treated it as an invitation. They named it not by what it destroyed, but by what it might reveal. And with a stubbornness bordering on spiritual ferocity, they did what humans always do in the face of impossibility: they studied until curiosity outweighed caution. They died, recalibrated, died again, recalculated, and returned still. The Sarati expected surrender. Humanity instead invented strategy. Failure wasn't final, it was data. Pain wasn't deterrent, it was compass. The Sarati historians later wrote. The others feared the abyss. Humanity feared only not reaching its far side. The rift did not frighten them, stagnation did. The council, now alarmed, attempted covert interference to slow the research, but the humans adapted with horrifying elegance. Every setback made them more resilient. Every casualty made them more determined. The Sarati, who had mastered stagnation disguised as equilibrium, watched a younger civilization weaponize aspiration. Humanity did not seek to conquer physics, they argued with it until physics budged. And then, the moment that broke the galaxy's silence. Instead of exploiting the rift for advantage, humanity broadcast the breakthrough. Not as trophy, not as leverage, as invitation. They sent an open transmission into the void, decrypted in hundreds of languages by accident of universality. If there are others watching, the door is real. We built a way through. You are welcome. No species in recorded galactic history had ever shared a cosmic discovery without extracting concession, tribute, or status. Humanity gave the universe its next frontier, for free, as if progress was not conquest but gift. The Sereti watchers felt the cultural quake ripple across their political substrate, younger minds, dissenting scholars, frontier theorists, all whispering the same forbidden realization. They are not just learning the galaxy. They are teaching it how to evolve again. This was the true moment the Concord lost control, not of space, not of law, but of narrative. Because a civilization that treats discovery as a public inheritance instead of private possession is not participating in history, it is redefining the purpose of existence itself. For ages uncounted, the galaxy believed the apex of intelligence was stability. Humanity quietly revealed that the apex might instead be unfinishedness embraced as destiny. To the Sereti Council's horror, their younger scholars began quoting human transmissions with something dangerously like admiration. They are not reaching upward because they believe they are strong. They are reaching upward because tomorrow deserves a witness. When a civilization begins to admire another, containment is already lost. The Council's final attempt to frame humanity as unstable backfired when records leaked showing just how many times humans had bled for worlds not their own. For strangers. For principles. For possibilities never meant to profit them. And suddenly, across the cold quilt of old star nations, something began to thaw that had not thawed in galaxies of time: permission to hope. The Sereti saw the next disaster forming like sunrise breaking through walls. Curiosity would soon become inspiration, inspiration would become imitation, and imitation would become a revolution of becoming across all stagnant spacefaring powers. Humanity was no longer a species. It was catalyst. They had no throne, yet they moved empires. No empire, yet they remapped what empire meant. No mastery, yet they walked as if mastery was simply a future version of themselves waiting up ahead. This was the dawning terror. Humanity was not going to join the galaxy. Humanity was going to wake it up. The Sereti realized too late that humanity's power did not come from weapons, territory, or longevity. It came from a trait the ancient empires had bled themselves dry trying to extinguish: becoming is more important than being. Where older civilizations clung to identity like stone tablets, humanity treated identity like software, patchable, iterable, rebuildable mid-flight. They did not fear rewriting themselves, they expected to. The galaxy, which had fossilized itself into tradition, had no defense against a species that treated limitation as draft mode. This is why their bravery seemed alien. Humans didn't see courage as defiance, they saw it as maintenance. You burn through fear not to appear strong, but to stay alive in your becoming. And when their explorers finally pierced the rift and returned with telemetry that rewrote cosmology itself, their first message wasn't conquest or triumph or superiority, it was wonder. It's bigger than we thought. And more beautiful. The Sereti archivists noted, with dread disguised as academic detachment, that humanity still sounded grateful after surviving something that would have unminded any other species. They were not hardened by peril, they were affirmed by it. The Council tried one last gambit, a public trial, a tribunal disguised as diplomacy, meant to shame humanity into respecting proper cosmic order. They summoned human diplomats expecting fear or pleading. Instead, they received something infinitely more destabilizing: curiosity. One of the Terran envoys, before the chamber of 100 elder worlds, simply asked, "On whose behalf do you fear us? We have not taken. We have only given." There was no arrogance in his voice, only bewildered honesty. It is the helplessness of tyrants that a gift they cannot price feels like theft. Humans did not arrive to dominate the galaxy. They arrived and accidentally made conquest obsolete. Throughout every corridor of the Concord, small rebellions of thought began crystallizing, scholars comparing stagnation charts, frontier engineers revisiting forbidden research, younglings whispering of explorers who share, not hoard. This was the contagion the Sereti never planned for, not human technology, but human orientation toward tomorrow. A Sereti philosopher, later exiled for intellectual sedition, described the shift in a forbidden essay. We had forgotten that civilizations are rivers, not monuments. The Terrans did not break our order, they reminded us we had damned ourselves. The first Allied world did not defect by treaty, it defected by imitation. It launched an expedition without permission. No tribute, no petition, no doctrine. Just curiosity made sovereign again. And then another world. And another. Not in war, in awakening. The Sereti could stop armies, but not hunger for wonder. The humans did not even realize they had ignited a renaissance. They simply kept building, as if the universe's silence were not warning but invitation. They deployed navigators to chart what lay beyond the far edge of mapped safe space, not because of glory, but because someone has to go first or no one will know where the path begins. This is what broke the Concorde's spine. Humanity didn't seek leadership. The galaxy started following anyway. Their bravery was not spectacle, it was infrastructure. Reliability forged into myth by repetition. They kept going after fear should have ended them. And that is the most terrifying kind of persistence, not a roar, but an unfaltering step. Some Sereti rulers still whispered of containment. But their own younger citizens, future counselors, future engineers, future shapers of cosmic law, had seen what humanity truly embodied. A horizon with no ceiling. A future that keeps rewriting itself until it fits everyone who dares to walk into it. A destiny not owned, but discovered. Across 1,000 systems, quietly, secretly, rebelliously, philosophies changed before policies did. Hope evolves first, law merely limps after it. By the time the Sereti recognized that tomorrow had already defected to the Terran temperament, the transformation was irreversible. They were no longer preventing a rising power. They were witnessing the return of momentum to history. Humanity didn't conquer the galaxy. Humanity reminded it how to move again. By the time the Sereti Council admitted the shift could no longer be contained, change had already metastasized beyond their reach. Entire civilizations that had once waited centuries for permission now launched expeditions with Terran-led starplanners drafting their mission scaffolds. But what unsettled the galaxy most wasn't speed, it was permissionlessness. Humanity treated discovery not as property or rank, but as birthright. The act of seeking became a civic virtue. Children grew up knowing that mystery is not a border, it is an invitation. For elder empires, discovery had always been burdened by ritual, who you must be to qualify, which lineage you must descend from, which scars make you worthy. Humanity shattered that calculus simply by never using it. Their explorers were not saints, royals, or engineered prodigies, they were anyone willing to step forward. The galaxy was shocked to realize that most Terran pioneers were not even the strongest or the smartest of their species. Just the ones who could not bear a smaller tomorrow. The Sereti had always believed danger purifies a civilization, that fear sculpts obedience and obedience sustains order. Humanity inverted this, danger did not make them obedient, it made them inventive. Where other species built fortresses, humans built instruments. Where others calibrated risk downward, humans calibrated resilience upward. This was not madness, it was an evolutionary choice. If the cost of survival is shrinking, then survival is only a slower form of death. When a Terran expedition mapped the unstable nebula known as the Ashen Veil, a region every Concorde archive had classified as terminal, they returned with a living sample of its biosphere, a microorganism that metabolized cosmic radiation into structural latticework. The Sereti saw a catastrophe waiting to bloom. Humanity saw infrastructure. They didn't weaponize it, they domesticated potential. Their first application was not a shield or cannon but a bridge, a radiation-grown scaffold that could stabilize wormhole fractures. Advancement through generosity, that was the logic no tyrant could preempt. Meanwhile rebellions across the Concorde required no armies. They began as scholarship, then engineering, then escapements of thought. Citizens did not proclaim revolt, they simply stopped waiting. The Sereti had ruled by monopoly on what is possible. Humanity cracked that monopoly open by demonstration, not rhetoric. You cannot legislate a ceiling once someone proves the sky is not the roof but the floor. One Sereti counselor, in a closed confession not meant for surviving record, admitted. We feared their weapons. We should have feared their refusal to apologize for being unfinished. Because unfinished things evolve. And evolving things eventually outgrow their chains. The galaxy's oldest civilizations were centuries deep into cynicism, but the newcomers reintroduced a heresy the ancients had forgotten: optimism as engineering discipline. Humanity did not wait for permission to become better, they built the next version of themselves and deployed it live. Even their failures produced forward motion, because the crash was still farther than others had ever dared to leap. At first, the Council tried to portray Terrans as reckless disruptors. But a quiet crisis began. Younger species were no longer ashamed to imagine futures larger than their inheritance. And once imagination defects, compliance starves. So a question spread, first whispered, then studied, then spoken aloud. If they are not afraid of tomorrow, why are we? That was the moment the Sereti lost the timeline. Because courage, the Terran kind, is contagious. Not spectacle. Not posturing. Simply permission to attempt the impossible out loud. It was not humanity's strength the galaxy feared. It was the realization that strength is not a prerequisite for beginning. Bravery came first, mastery followed inevitably. And in every star system where the Terran expeditions passed, one truth remained behind like a gravitational echo. No empire survives the return of hope. When the Sereti finally confronted the humans directly, not with ambassadors or politics, but with the ancient instinct every stagnant power eventually regresses to, they expected Terrans to posture, threaten, bargain for advantage. Instead, they found something far more destabilizing: humans grieved for them. The Sereti believed they were defending order, the Terrans saw a civilization suffocating itself behind armor it no longer remembered choosing. The confrontation did not begin with weapons. It began with a refusal, not of terms, but of worldview. Humanity would not accept that risk is a crime. They would not accept that progress belongs only to the ordained. They would not accept that destiny is an inheritance instead of a construction. And when the Sereti demanded surrender of expansion rights, a Terran envoy answered with a sentence that would ripple across 1,000 star systems. Discovery is not a privilege. Discovery is a pulse. The Council was furious, not because the words were harmful, but because they were true enough to hear yourself in them. Truth is the one contagion tyrants can't quarantine. Once recognized, it continues thinking inside you without permission. Their scholars tried to censor the message, but the encryption failed. Terrans did not broadcast speeches, they broadcast architectures. Ideas embedded in demonstration, not declaration. And so the Sereti struck first, a silent interdiction pulse meant to collapse a Terran forward station beyond the rift corridor. Not a war, an amputation of momentum. A warning disguised as inevitability. They erased a beacon and waited for the Terrans to finally fear something. But humanity did not answer with retaliation. They answered with reconstruction, faster than erasure. The station reappeared 3 days later, rebuilt not behind defenses, but in plain openness, an act of defiance more complete than violence. You cannot unbuild us. Every attempt to halt them became demonstration material for resilience engineering. The Council's threat display had been inverted into a Terran case study. For the first time in centuries, the Sereti hesitated, because they could no longer predict escalation. A species that does not fear loss, but reflexively rebuilds past it, is not strategizable the way empire-trained minds require. The Sereti understood conquest, they did not understand becoming. Becoming is a moving target, a system with no stable attack surface. It is not defended, it adapts. They were fighting not a power, but a trajectory. And beneath the Council's palace laws, beneath its ritual facades, beneath obedience calcified into culture, their own citizens began noticing the mismatch. The danger was not spreading death, it was spreading capacity. Humanity's invasion was not territorial. It was epistemic. They were not taking worlds, they were reopening futures. The Sereti could have dominated humanity militarily at that stage, every analyst confirmed it. But conquest requires moral certainty, and the Council's certainty had already cracked. They did not fear Terran weapons, they feared Terran proof. If a younger species could rewrite reality by choosing courage over permission, then what excuse did the elder powers have for their own arrested becoming? This is how an empire collapses from the inside. First disbelief, then doubt, then envy of the unafraid. The Council ordered a second interdiction, harder, final, surgical, but hesitation had already infected the chain of command. Advisors questioned whether erasing the Terrans would merely martyr their philosophy. Others warned that suppression would accelerate imitation. The Council realized they were losing not a conflict, but control of the narrative of possibility. Humanity had done the one thing every empire fears. They had made tomorrow visible again. And once a horizon becomes visible, no doctrine in history has ever successfully ordered minds to forget it. The Council's crisis was no longer external. Its battlefield was now belief. The Sereti had spent thousands of cycles mastering control through forecasting. History was a ledger to them, not a river. Every future was a solvable equation so long as variables remained obedient. But humanity was not a variable, humanity was recursion. Every time the Council tried to collapse Terran momentum back into prediction, the humans pivoted into a larger frame of reference. They did not resist containment by force, they resisted it by outgrowing the frame itself. And a force that grows cannot be cornered, corners dissolve behind it like scaffolding made irrelevant. In desperation, the Sereti turned to their oldest weapon, narrative erasure. They began purging archives, censoring study clades, banning imitation expeditions, trying to recast Terran explorers as reckless anomalies rather than a philosophical contagion. But censorship is only effective where hope is absent. Humanity had already ignited curiosity across 1,000 lesser civilizations, and curiosity, once oxygenated by example, is not a spark but a chemical conversion. It does not extinguish, it reaches flashpoint. Some Sereti scholars warned the Council that they were repeating the cosmic error that birthed the stagnation age itself, mistaking silence for mastery, forgetting that coordinated stillness is merely entropy negotiating a throne. But the Council no longer dealt in argument, they dealt in delay, hoping history would freeze until their fear regained vocabulary. Meanwhile, humanity kept building. Not banners, not monuments, routes. Corridors of transit. Shared scaffolding of becoming. They made infrastructure behave like invitation. Instead of fortifications, they built on-ramps to tomorrow, not hoarded for themselves but openly architected as commons. And this, more than any discovery or technology, broke the cosmic power structure, they democratized trajectory. The Sereti had once believed control of future shaping required custody of gateways. Humanity exposed the deeper truth, the future is not guarded, it is grown. So long as the seed of, there is more, survives inside a mind, empire cannot fully seal tomorrow. The only true lock on possibility is despair, and humanity simply refused to engineer despair. When Terran researchers began teaching allied species how to construct microfold drives, simplified starcrossers cheap enough for frontier villages to wield, the Council realized something horrifying: dominance was no longer about strength, but reach. And reach was moving beyond statehood, beyond decree, beyond lineage. The future was leaking into common hands. Every empire has a moment where suppression becomes indistinguishable from confession, the moment force reveals fear instead of superiority. The Sereti reached that threshold when they tried to criminalize unauthorized optimism. Courts began prosecuting not actions, but aspiration. And the galaxy saw, with clarity no broadcast could censor, that empire had become pathology, while humanity had become remission. Terran sociologists didn't gloat. They didn't even celebrate the ideological fracture they'd triggered. They regarded the shift with something nearly sacred: responsibility. Because if courage could become airborne, then stewardship must become scalable. Humanity refused to let expansion rot into colonization, they built consensus tech, cooperative NAV ethics, shared frameworks for mutual assent. Not dominance, co-ascendance. The Sereti leadership mistook this restraint for weakness. They never understood that restraint is simply power wielded by those who no longer require spectacle to recognize themselves as whole. It terrified them that humanity didn't covet the throne, because how do you bargain with a species whose ambition is direction, not rulership? The council tried what all fading hegemonies try last, isolation. They sealed borders, declared Terran thought contaminant, burned transit treaties, and declared the old order immutable by decree. But you cannot isolate against demonstration. Every new Terran expedition was a sermon of proof. Becoming exists. Forward exists. The Sereti could evacuate diplomacy, they could not vacuum the sky. For the first time in millennia, control slipped not by rebellion but by irrelevance. The council ruled yesterday. Humanity inhabited tomorrow. The battlefield was no longer fleets. The battlefield was possibility allocation. And humanity had already won by simply refusing to shrink. The Sereti leadership finally understood too late that they were not facing an enemy, they were facing a successor epoch. Their power had never been about fleets or laws, it had been about narrative monopoly, the right to define the size of tomorrow. Humanity had stolen nothing. They had simply proved the horizon was a lie, and once a lie breaks, its architects begin to collapse with it. The first internal defections were not soldiers or governors, they were teachers. The moment learning realigned toward becoming rather than containment, loyalty began to invert across generations. The youngest Sereti no longer asked what is allowed, but rather, what is reachable. And reach is a solvent, it dissolves permission. Empires drown not when overthrown, but when outgrown. By now Terran presence was everywhere not through conquest but through relational gravity, any civilization that touched them began iterating faster, thinking wider, aspiring vertically instead of latently. Humanity had discovered something older civilizations had forgotten. Discovery is not the act of finding land, it is the act of renegotiating what counts as possible. The Council attempted a final maneuver, a doctrine called the Great Halting, meant to reframe restraint as wisdom and fear as stewardship. But narrative alchemy could not disguise rot anymore. The galaxy had tasted movement again, and movement is addictive. Species that had once lowered themselves to fit the old equilibrium now realized they had been kneeling before stillness, mistaking stagnation for architecture. Humanity had simply walked in and reminded them that motion is not heresy, it is oxygen. Terran explorers became living contradictions to the old order. They embraced risk without fetishizing ruin. They embraced change without erasing identity. They shared tools without demanding worship. This was the blasphemy the Sereti could not metabolize, power without dominion. Because their worldview required that leadership and ownership be fused, they could not comprehend a civilization that built the ladder upward and didn't demand tribute from those climbing after them. To them, humanity's generosity looked like supremacy in camouflage, because they had no conceptual vocabulary for uplift that does not extract. But the galaxy did. And the galaxy was watching. Soon, migrations began not of bodies but of allegiances. Scientists defected intellectually, philosophers defected ethically, young fleets drifted outward on unsanctioned exploration under Terran mentorship. The Sereti still held territory, but no longer trajectory. An estate that controls space but not direction is already an artifact, not a destiny. The final crack came not with battle, but with a broadcast, not from humanity, but from within the Sereti's own cultural marrow. A dissident mathematician, once a state laureate, published an open theorem distilled into a single devastating axiom. If a species can still become, it is younger than any empire that refuses to. The galaxy did not read that as philosophy. They read it as diagnosis. And in that moment, the Sereti understood the thing they had never prepared for, not defeat, but obsolescence. You can defend a throne from invaders, you cannot defend it from relevance decay. Humanity had not toppled the order. They had simply made a larger future visible, and visibility is irreversibility. Their bravery was not an act. It was an ambient property of their civilization. And once courage becomes atmospheric, collapse of fear-based empires is not a matter of resistance, it is a matter of timeframe. Humanity was not destroying the old world. They were finishing it, by opening the one that comes next. In the end, the Sereti did not fall with an explosion, they exhaled. Collapse arrived the way sunrise does, undeniably, slowly, and then all at once. What once was empire became archive. What once was doctrine became footnote. And while officials still clung to the illusion of dominion, the galaxy at large had already stepped into post-permission history. An age where exploration was not an extremity but a civic instinct, and humanity the first species bold enough to say aloud that mystery is not a hazard, but a habitat. The most astonishing turn was that the Terrans never declared victory. They had been raised on frontiers, not finish lines. To them, the Sereti were not a vanquished enemy, merely a civilization accidentally stranded inside its own past. Humanity did not gloat, did not humiliate, did not sculpt statues of conquest. Their only monument was a corridor, a spanning arc of transit arrays across once forbidden space, a living bridge through which every species could step, if willing, into a version of themselves unshackled by dread. Not a throne, a runway. And when the dust of ideology finally settled, the Sereti, stripped now of sacred certainty, did something no empire had managed in its twilight, they migrated forward. Quietly. Not with dignity, but with honesty. Because shame is the first signal that a mind is re-entering growth. Humanity met them not as victors, but as shepherds of tomorrow. The Terran envoys did not deliver demands, only invitation. If you can still imagine yourself unfinished, then you can still belong to what comes next. It was the first mercy the galaxy had ever seen that didn't feel like condescension, because it did not ask anyone to shrink. It asked them to resume becoming. Soon after, grand strategy dissolved into shared architecture, joint academies of discovery, pan-species NAV guilds, cross-cultural research fleets that treated curiosity the way old empires treated sovereignty. The old map of the galaxy fractured into something larger, not boundaries but gradients of reachable futures. And at the apex of this change was the simplest of Terran convictions: you are not finished. This was the core of the Terran heresy, and eventually its gospel. Every civilization is a draft of the next one. The Sereti never feared human strength, not truly. They feared the mirror humanity carried, a future in which fear was not an anchor but a launch pad. A tomorrow not inherited but manufactured. And when at last their final council dissolved, its archivist wrote the most honest epitaph their age had ever produced. Their victory was not over us, it was over the ceiling. From there forward, the galaxy reorganized itself not by dominance, but by vector. Political borders mattered less than philosophical altitude. What counted was not where a species stood, but which direction it was still capable of leaning. And humanity, restless, iterative, endlessly self-upgrading, simply kept walking, never above others, only ahead of what had once been impossible. Because this was their secret all along. Humanity's power is not discovery, it is the refusal to stop discovering. Not bravery, but the inability to make a home from fear. Not superiority, but momentum in human shape. Empires conquer territory. Humans conquer limitation. And long after the Sereti passed into tradition, long after the last gatekeeper ideology cracked under its own drought of wonder, the chronicles of the Second Expansion Age opened with a single uncontested truth, a truth older than war, wider than empire, and impossible to bury once learned. The galaxy did not change humanity. Humanity reminded the galaxy that it could change it all.